Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of the Reparative Media Podcast. I'm here with Scott Allen Cambo, who I know from Northwestern as a former PhD student and candidate, and now is head of human-centered artificial intelligence at Vera. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, good to see you, AJ.
Good to see you too. Thanks for joining me on the pod.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So yes, we are here to talk about the hot topic of the moment, AI, and all of the ways in which it can both be potentially something we should be concerned about, but also some of the benefits of artificial intelligence, which I think is something that's maybe been lost in the current conversation. But before we get to all of that, I'd love our viewers to get a little bit of context as to who you are and how you came to this work. So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in computer science. Did you always know that you wanted to do it kind of for good?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I I I was introduced to just the general idea that like one could work with computers from my dad, actually, who had no college degree. So I was raised by a single father, my sister and I, and he had no college degree, but he actually learned some electronics as a radio officer in the Coast Guard. And he was able to use those skills to get a job as an ATM repair technician for NCR. That's how long ago this was. NCR was a company before they got bought by AT&T, I think. This was in the early 90s or so. And he'd come home with these giant like ATM parts. It was like it was probably something that was like a RAM stick that was like the size of a typical 90s trapper keeper back then. And he'd tell us about, like this is what lets the computer do this. And he'd be really excited to tell us about everything he was learning about the computing technology in the ATMs. And eventually it got to a point where even we could afford a personal computer. We had an NCR branded personal computer, which I don't know, maybe that's pretty, I assume that's pretty rare. But we got it. It was super bare bones, and the only way we could use it is my dad had to teach us how to use the command line and everything. This was pre-Windows PCs. So I think that was kind of like my first like introduction to it, like what you can do with it. But at that time I'm like maybe like 9 years old or something. So there's only we didn't even have access to the internet to look up like how do I program something or anything like that. I just had to kind of like have a little notepad of commands that I could use and know where certain directories were, where there were little games and stuff like that. And I did that for kind of a while, and then we got our first internet connection and things got a little more exciting. I made a GeoCities website and everything and had a lot of fun. But at that point, I ended up getting really into music. I hit the this is I feel like this is becoming a tour of the 90s all of a sudden, but I really caught the ska punk bug in Massachusetts. And I saw these terrible ska punk bands in central Massachusetts that it was just so much fun to see them play. It looked like they were having so much fun. And I thought like, oh, well, these bands are not good, but this is so fun. Like, I bet I could do that. And so it ended up focusing a lot of, my time and energy on making music and things like that. And while doing that, thinking about like, well, okay, now digital recording is becoming a thing. Like, how would I record it onto my computer? By the time I was late in high school, you could actually kind of do that. The sound quality was terrible, but you could do it. And so computing was always this thing that was like in the background, but I think also because of the punk stuff that I was into, this idea that there are systemic issues that need to be addressed, maybe not through punk rock, but like there are issues that we should be paying attention to. was always kind of like those two things were always kind of circulating in my life. After high school, I actually ended up working as a carpenter. We couldn't afford to send me to college, so I worked for a carpenter as a carpenter for my friends, our bass player's father, doing like cabinetry and things like that. And in the evening, I worked for this nonprofit. Worked for, I volunteered for this nonprofit called Don't Complain, Fix It Yourself. It was a very like punk like nonprofit designed to put on all ages concerts in the Worcester, Massachusetts area to raise money for like local music programs and things like that were on the chopping block in terms of funding. And I just kind of got into the habit of like, well, anytime you start a new venture like this, like what I had been doing from high school is like it would be like $5 at the door, but $4 if you brought a canned good for the Greater Worcester Food Bank and stuff. So it was we always had this kind of like, like we're gonna organize this thing, but we're trying to like find ways to make that thing as efficient in helping the community as possible. So later on, like after the housing crisis in 2008, where our company just, we couldn't weather that, our construction company just couldn't weather that event.
Yeah.
We went out of business, and I actually went to college thinking like, oh, I should learn a little bit of business so that I can start a cabinet business and do a little bit better than my boss did, and times like this. As soon as I did that, I was, I was taking some classes, realized that one, I enjoyed them a lot more than I thought I would. And two, I was better at it than I thought I was. So that really made me think, well, like this opens a whole new world of possibilities. I'd really like to go into computer science. And I sold off like half of my tools and moved in with my aunt and uncle in order to save money while I put everything else toward paying for classes. And yeah, I don't know. It was like very much like it was important for me to be able to rely on members of my family and my community in order to make that transition happen. And it was something that as I was getting, to the place where I could actually get a job with those computing skills, I couldn't imagine doing it in any way that wouldn't have some kind of social good element to it. Like it really felt like an important thing. So the kind of weird thing was, I actually got an opportunity to transfer from community college to Cornell University, which is so funny. Like it was the only community college outside of New York State where they had this kind of like matriculation agreement. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But an even further bit of luck is that at that time I was so ignorant about academia or anything. I didn't even know Cornell was like an Ivy League school. I just saw that everyone else was really excited about that opportunity, and I really enjoyed my visit there and talking with them about information science and human computer interaction. I thought like, hey, I should give it a shot. But I don't think it really clicked like how different this university would be until I got there. And at that point, when I realized like, oh, I'm being thrown into a world where 95% of the people I'm here in class with have privileges that not only did I not have, but like most of the people in the United States don't have. And I think from there, it just really became clear, like if I'm getting these skills, I need to be using it for something that's going to help change that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we don't talk about how academia, especially at these levels, are so elite.
Yeah.
And, there is this imbalance in the ecosystem where the people who have access to the best educations are sometimes the people who don't know how most people live, but then end up running
Right.
companies and society in ways that aren't reflective of the needs that people have, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there is this belief that computing and technology can help bridge some of those gaps. I'm sure that's kind of, especially at that time, that was very much like the vibe and the excitement around technology and the internet and all of that stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So then you got to you know what got your BA or BS, BA, BS,
Yeah, BS technically, but
yes.
yeah.
And then you worked a little bit before coming to Northwestern for your PhD, is
Hmm.
that right?
I did. Yeah, it was this kind of situation where at the time I met my now wife at Cornell. We were serious and dating, and I had taken kind of like an extra semester to complete a minor in cognitive science and a this, what do they call it, like an um honors in research, I think is what they called it at Cornell. So I took an extra semester there to complete that, which put me as a winter graduate. And that just happened to be perfect timing for grad school applications. So I was, at the time I was doing a lot of research with folks who were doing social network analysis at Cornell, and I actually had met Professor Jeremy Bernholtz there, who was still
Right.
working with Professor Jeff Hancock at the Social Media Lab. So I was really like interested in learning more about human computer interaction research, and the way that I could kind of get my foot in the door there was being like, the person who had a little bit of programming skills that I could help with. And that gave me access to all these grad students who encouraged me to pursue research. I mean, part of the other reason I got along great with grad students is they were a lot closer to my age than undergraduates. I was still older than most of them, but everyone was still very nice and welcoming. But yeah, I think that really kind of encouraged me to work a little bit more on research. And then I applied to grad school. I also just randomly applied to something called Data Science for Social Good, which a friend of mine had sent my way. Said, I think this sounds like something you'd be interested in. At the time, I was getting interested in things like machine learning and natural language processing, but I don't even think this would have been the spring of 2014. I don't even think I had heard the term data science, or if I did, I don't think I fully knew what it meant. But then, a little Google searching, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like something I'd be interested in. Put in an application and got the fellowship, and ended up working with folks at University of Chicago on projects that included like working with Skills for Chicagoland's Future in order to find ways that we can use data to figure out how to kind of cross-train people into new careers that are, that are already going to use a lot of the skills that they already have. And so when I started to like think about data science in that way, that was kind of the new way that I really wanted to think about what I would do with computer science. And a lot of my grad school time was figuring out how to like how would I recreate that in this kind of PhD research environment.
Yeah. So what did you end up coming up with at grad school? For those of our listeners who aren't in academia, PhD students write a dissertation, which is a long study or an almost book on some topic.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure it out in grad school. I did some work with the Center for Behavioral Intervention Technology at Northwestern, and I think that really got me to think about some of the challenges with some interdisciplinary work with computer science. I think like interdisciplinary teams are absolutely essential, but there needs to be like a certain amount of translation, and sometimes I was kind of put in a spot where I could see the translation not going well. Like I could see that what what um what was being proposed at the time as like, hey, we could use the data from people's phones to figure out like when they're depressed and then intervene right at that moment. To me, I immediately started getting really concerned about that as I saw like one, it's just even as a grad student asking a lot of questions, I wasn't getting a clear enough answer about like like when we're talking about mental health, how are we really going to relate that to the data in a phone? At the time, the thinking was like, well, the phone has all the data you could possibly ever want. Machine learning is so powerful, we can infer from that data whatever we want. So obviously, this is a win. But as the student who was tasked with actually trying to do those models, I realized that the concept that we're going after, this sort of nebulous, like mental health concept, was not clear enough and it wasn't tied well enough with the data. And that to me was an interesting human computer interaction research challenge, but it wasn't something I could do in that context where they really wanted to get to applied very quickly. So after that, I was working with some folks who focus more on kind of design and social computing. And that was really helpful, like to be thinking about the connection between how we perceive a technology and how we design the interface and what's going on under the hood. And that connection was just that became really important to me. And so with that kind of thinking about that kind of like pipeline from what an algorithm is doing to how it is presented to the user to how the user perceives it and takes action on that information was fascinating to me. And I think where it really got to be a cohesive like thesis proposal was when I started thinking about what happens when the thing that the machine learning algorithm is trying to learn is actually really subjective. And everything about what we knew, and honestly, what we still do right now when we design machine learning algorithms is under the assumption that this thing is entirely objective. And if we just ask enough people and take the mean or the median response, that must be the ground truth, true response, which like, I am sure everyone, you and your audience all know, like, there's a lot of people who don't fit into the average or the mean or the median. And that's not always the thing that's going to give you, that's going to give a lot of people the experience that they're told that they're going to get. So yeah, that really got into this research topic that I felt like the only people that really had the good answers for that type of the questions that I had were honestly people in the social sciences, but specifically people, feminist scholars in the social science who had to deal with coming into an environment where they could tell that there were a lot of assumptions being made about how things like gender dynamics work that were just wrong. And they didn't line up with their experience at all. And they had created kind of a very useful framework for thinking about, why is it that an established group, an established scientific community can be so convinced that they have found the right answer. And yet us as members of the community that they're studying, women, we wholeheartedly disagree with this research on its fundamental principles in many ways. But why is this conversation so hard and how can we sort it out? And the ideas of things like reflexivity and positionality that came out of that were things that I thought would be extremely important and useful in the data science community and the AI development community. So a lot of my thesis was around how important those ideas are, not just for qualitative research, but also for quantitative research and computer science. And also what would those practices look like if we were to use them for the kind of subjective challenges and intersubjective challenges we run into with computing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I ended up going with all of that.
Yeah, that's really great. I feel like I'm hoping there's some connection from that perspective on data science in terms of challenging presumed neutrality of the machine to the work that you do now in this thing called like human-centered AI, which I'm super excited to get into. But I think that what you were tapping into there at that time was what a lot of people, it seemed like in computer science, were tapping into, both in academia and in corporate research, right? Folks who were developing these AI models for corporations or researching machine learning in academia, and that field diversifying and bringing in more women, more people of color, more women of color, et cetera, who are just kind of challenging, well, you're making a lot of assumptions right now. And in my experience, assumptions tend to not benefit me or represent me, right?
Right.
Well, so when we think about centering the human in these machine contexts, we are talking about thinking about all of the ways that people differently identify with the human, right? Based on
Yeah.
their positionality. And that seems to be something that, for many complex reasons, more quantitative computer science oriented folks traditionally over the past few decades, maybe just because there have been so many white cisgender heteronormative people in it, just don't think about, because so much of the rest of society makes it that like they don't have to think about their identity. It's all set up
Right.
for
Yeah.
them, right? So I'm curious, just like how you, if I articulated that perspective correctly, how did you then take that kind of theoretical perspective and how are you bringing that to the real world? Maybe this is the time to talk about Vera, but however.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a great time to talk about the work we do at Vera. So at Vera, we kind of are doing two things. Um, we're both a consulting company that provides auditing services, third-party algorithm auditing services that can include everything from like, okay, there is this specific law that requires these specific things for your, for people to know about your algorithm, and a third party has to do it. So in that case, it's generally pretty clear, but a lot of these laws are a work in progress. So there's a lot of like connecting what we know about the legal landscape to the data that a client actually has and helping them contextualize it with the algorithms that they actually have. So there's kind of like the technical auditing part of it, but there's also an aspect of this that I think really leverages the human computer interaction research area, which is making connections between the technology we develop and the impact it can have on not just users and customers, but every stakeholder. So the impact it has on the people that provided the data, which is not always a user. In different cases, sometimes that's data that's purchased from a third party. Sometimes that third party never asked the original users if they could sell it. So there's a lot of things in technology development space that are worth inspecting for any company that's interested in doing responsible AI, which now that I'm in this position where people come to us asking for audits, what I really like about it is I get to see this side of these kind of like medium-sized startups that are, pulling in a lot of business, and they're maybe like 100 to 200 people, but they're certainly not at the size of like Salesforce or something like that. And they really do want to do this responsibly. They honestly do, but there's structural challenges to that, and there's and also they need the guidance. They need to kind of understand how to make that connection between the work that they do and the people that are potentially impacted. And I think what's really great about that is that it's something that takes a lot of time to really understand. I think it takes a lot of like reading on how technology has impacted people to kind of like have those examples in your head. As those of you at home that are watching video, I am a white dude. I'm a straight white dude, and like I haven't had every experience that we should be careful of. So I try to take time to read, how these algorithms are impacting people, and also how people are afraid that they might be impacted, and how they react to it, and helping them understand what I like to do is kind of leave our clients with the tools they need to go beyond their own kind of position in the world. And yeah, so far we've had a lot of good luck with that. the other side of what we do is we're trying to build products that make responsible AI more of a team effort. Often on these kind of startup teams, you'll differentiate by specialty. So you'll have your data science person, you'll have your engineer, you'll have your product designer, you'll have your product manager, and then, you know, none of them can talk to the executives except through their management hierarchy and everything. So those structural challenges we also try to help sort out, and we try to make it so that when we're talking about responsible AI, this is not just something that the data scientist is responsible for. It's a whole team effort to kind of understand how the work that they do impacts the work that someone else does, which impacts the work that someone else does, and how all of those decisions lead up to something that can be, either really harmful or really amazing. But I think a key part of responsible AI is not just getting the algorithm in line with how people are thinking, also getting honestly the whole business in line, the entire business model, and getting everyone in the company with this at least enough of the same tools that when there's a request by a designer or data engineer, it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere. They kind of understand, like, oh, right, like the data scientist wants to know more about what happened in our user test, because they're trying to make that connection to real people.
Yeah, I love this focus on kind of interdependence and multidimensionality, which are keywords that actually come from many places, of course, but I know them from the relationship to intersectionality. And when you're looking
Yeah,
at any system, right? Any system, whether it be our food systems or our political system or our technological systems, everything is interdependent and requires very complex human interactions. And so
yeah,
honoring the different perspectives that go into producing whatever is produced is critical for any kind of sense of responsibility or justice or sustainability in that ecosystem. And it does seem like maybe a lot of the fears around AI right now are based on the fact that it's being deployed by these very large corporations that seem to be moving very fast and not thinking about all of the different inputs and impacts of what they have been doing, thinking about that interdependence and really honoring and being able to explain it to people. Which help. I want to shift to this question of like AI,
sure.
and what it is to you, because I think that right now most people still have the image of the singularity and the robots are coming for us kind of
Yeah,
thing.
sure.
But I imagine that there's different types of AI and also different things that have led us to this point where we can talk to a machine. You've been
Yeah.
mentioning algorithms and large language models and machine learning. So can you talk about like what is AI and how did we get to this point? What do people need to know about how these things have been developed? I know that's a big question and we know how much, but
No, it's great though. I mean, this is yeah, I think it's a really important question, because there AI is a big business opportunity right now. And anytime something is a big business opportunity, it can be uh the term itself as well as the technology itself is co-opted to you know to paint a picture of anything that people will pay money for. And so I think that one of the most important things to know right now is that AI is as much a marketing term as anything else right now. Like, it is amazing the things that we've seen called AI, and then we, work with people in different companies, and then we later find out that uh, AI is a huge stretch to be able to call that piece of software that. I mean, we've had lots of times where um, we've had a couple times where there would be a technology referred to as AI by the executives, the marketing team, and then when we sit down with the data science team, they're like, "Oh, actually, that's honestly just people. That's just a program that, puts this in front of puts this in front of like a real world expert, and they make the decision." And it's what's interesting about that specific scenario is that that's actually a good thing. That should be something to be proud of, that people are actually, that not just any person, but an expert is making a kind of AI assisted decision at the end. But it's just so strange how like quickly we want to give credit to this AI technology. And I think that has to do a lot with the rush to get investors excited about what different people can do with AI. So that's a whole lot on just sort of like why AI is a difficult term to pin down right now, especially. How I think about AI is honestly any algorithm that we designed with the specific purpose of doing a task that we had previously thought um, only people could really do, or human intelligence could really do. And even that one, I hesitate a little bit because there are really great intelligent algorithms that aren't even inspired. I'll put that in quotes because, even the inspired human, brain inspired algorithms are not very aligned with how the brain works. But there are a lot of algorithms that don't even take inspiration from the human brain. They take inspiration from things like how flocks of birds coordinate, or how or fluid dynamics and things like that. And while we don't think of that as like an intelligent process, the outcome is extremely helpful, and it's just as helpful as anything that we would design with like a to be like a human assistant, like we see with Chat GPT, or things that are designed specifically for that kind of experience or that kind of interaction.
That's really great. I love that. I mean, in my current book, I'm writing a lot about how do we think about our media ecosystem, and I'm using that kind of ecosystemic metaphor. I was really inspired by like Adrienne Maree Brown in her book Emergent Strategy, and trying to think about human organizing as akin to natural ways of organizing, like flocks of birds, right? How each individual bird moves on its own, but in concert with others, right? And how think about social movements that way. And I do think in the 21st century, I think a lot of people are looking more to nature and non-human influences for how do we organize ourselves and our information. So I think it's super helpful for people to know that AI does seem to be an outgrowth of these things called algorithms, which are essentially kind of rule sets, if you will, right? Like if something happens, then this will happen. And that can be how we think as humans, but can also be how a lot of other things think or intelligently move throughout this earth.
Totally. And I think what's difficult is, you're absolutely right. Algorithms are literally sets of rules. They're procedures. What makes AI unique is that those procedures are achieving something that seems like that seem like you shouldn't be able to do with just a bunch of set of rules. And that's because in machine learning really started to take off, where we suddenly started to think like, oh, right, we don't have to program all of these rules into the AI in order to understand English. We can start doing things like have a machine learning model that learns what to expect from, let's say, like the English language in general, and then we can go from there. And that's how we get this sort of like, I don't know what some people would call like these kind of emergent properties of AI. I mean, I hate to use that term because I think it gets used as a way to scare people into thinking that AI is about to take their jobs, and then it gets used to devaluate that person's work and career. But I think that there's a lot of things that honestly the people working on AI didn't expect for it to be able to do. And we're in that situation right now where we're all trying to figure out what ChatGPT can and can't do. But it's a situation where OpenAI has a lot to benefit from us being very confused about that.
That's an interesting statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about this kind of world that we're in now where we have these large companies, particularly GPT, because it seems like Google's product is not nearly as refined or something. And even that difference is interesting. Like how do you know how they developed these models and what went into them? I think that's the big question people have. How is
Yeah.
it so good? Was it scan? I mean, I think they say we weren't scanning your emails, right? Or like we
Oh,
just
right, with Google, yeah.
with Google, right? Or even because Chat OpenAI was working with Microsoft, so there's Outlook, and I feel like there's some concerns
Oh,
about that association.
yeah,
We scan the internet, scan Wikipedia, like books or
yeah,
art for the ones that are photo based or whatever.
sure.
Do you how do they scrape this? How do they use this data? Like what is this? How do they do this? Right?
Yeah, um, right. So right now, a lot of AI being developed in the last couple of years is built around what we call like large language models. They're also called foundation models when we talk about them beyond just like language. Um, so when we talk about things like DALL-E 2 that are generating images and things like that, we can kind of generalize that to be a foundation model. But the idea is that if you have enough data and enough computing power, you can basically just model the likelihood that if one thing happens in the world, that another thing will happen like that. And I don't mean that on just like if it rains today, people will be wearing umbrellas. I mean like everything down to like if someone asks a question like this, the likely response should be like this. And that's sort of how you get that Chat GPT experience. Um, to be a little bit more specific as to why Chat GPT and algorithms like Bard are suddenly feeling a lot more like interactive and lively, and people are a lot of people are uh, getting really concerned that they're sentient and they're gonna try to get them to divorce their wives, as one New York Times writer put it. Uh, the reason it feels like that is because they've started using this process called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And what that means is after you've got that initial foundation model that basically just says, like, given everything on the whole internet that we can get our hands on, if someone says a sentence like this, it's likely followed by a sentence like this. And so that's where you get these like patterns in biases being adopted, because as we know, like there's the if we were to just look at how much different people say which kinds of things on the internet, it's really not reflective of like how we each like feel and interact in the real world. There are unfortunately people who will spend all day every day on a forum talking about AR-15s and how to take down the government. That's a lot of data.
Hmm.
And the scale at which companies like OpenAI and Google collect this data is, I mean, I personally think that if they tried, they could do a much, much better job of filtering out those types of things. But the narrative that they give is that the amount of data they need to build these algorithms is too big to actually go through and filter, and it's too big to even document. So it's a lot of the narrative around why OpenAI is not telling people about what's in their data sets. They're not really telling people any kind of meaningful details about how they train the models or what hardware they use. Um, it's kind of hidden in this like, oh, well, we just got to move fast. It's a lot of data. Like we can't be bothered with it. Like this is just too important for mankind. Like we can't be slowed down by by documenting the data that we have coming in, or filtering out racist or sexist or every kind of bigotry that we see on the internet from this. I think the other part that makes this really complicated is that we don't all agree on what should be on the internet, the same way we don't all agree what an AI should learn from the internet. So
Mm-hmm.
when you have a company like OpenAI, they would much rather avoid that conversation internally
Mm-hmm.
and hope that nobody really forces them to have it externally.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Because of course that's political. That's what the realm of
Mhm.
politics is. What is acceptable discourse, right? What is
Yeah.
allowed and not allowed? And um, as we have this discourse right now of we should pause on AI and slow down and all that stuff, I think some people are, especially even business people, are like, well, you can't stop capitalism. If it's technology that will lower costs, it will be used. And a lot of people are also saying, well, how do we even regulate it? Congress is just getting around to regulating social media, which has been around for over 15 years.
Yeah.
So it seems like companies are just going to do this. If I was dreaming regulation as you're speaking, I'm thinking we do need something of a like transparency around data sets. And it's
Yeah.
not acceptable as an answer where you can't, it's too big. We can't tell you what's in here, right?
Right.
If we're going to take a pause, take a year and try and figure that out.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you were scraping Twitter for 10 years, that's a lot of complicated data. And what we know from these social media companies is that they've never been good at filtering what should be
No.
said and what shouldn't be said. They have these rules around what is acceptable on the platforms, but we know from so many studies, so many things that from their own rules shouldn't be on there are on there, and some of the things that are totally safe are taken off, right?
Right.
Um, and so I think there's a lot of skepticism that we can ever get to a point of actually ethically having these technologies because we've run so far afield for so long. So
Yeah.
I am curious on your perspective on, do you think there is a way that we can scale responsible AI, especially without regulation? Seeing if regulation is not going to happen, that's a big question. But if that's too big a question, I am curious. Just what are the positive uses of AI in your perspective? Okay, wait,
Yeah.
hold on.
Okay.
Pause. My
Oh,
phone is
sure.
going. Oh, I thought I lesson to do not disturb when I do these podcasts so that I can not be disturbed. It's so annoying. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm going to take a note when this happens so I don't um, have this in the final cut.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No worries.
Let's see. It's my camera. Camera looks decent. Okay, I'm going to ask the question again.
Sure.
Um, but taking a note there. Okay. Okay. So question is, you know, do you think there is a way to responsibly regulate AI given where we are now? And if that's too big a question, what do you think are some of the positive uses of AIs that people should be excited about that can be used responsibly and won't drastically harm our society?
Yeah. I mean, it's, they're both very difficult questions and they've become even more difficult in the last like few months. I will say, when I think about the positive uses of AI, I'm always kind of coming back to one of the, like really one of the first real practical use cases of it, which is as an information retrieval tool. Like, this idea that like we're now at a point where like no person could conceivably read every book and definitely couldn't conceivably read everything on the internet. And so we're always going to have these challenges in finding the information we need to exist in an information economy and exist in this kind of information age. And it seems like a simple task, but it actually gets pretty complicated because often when you're looking for information, the idea that's in your head isn't clear, because if it was, then you probably wouldn't need that information so much. So then it becomes like, well, the interaction with how you get that information is now important. And that could be an entirely different algorithm than, the way that Google initially conceived of search, of web search and things like that. So these kind of like, this idea of like how to connect people with the information that they need to do a thing, it's actually, I wish more people would focus on just that problem, because that is a problem that can get endlessly complex depending on the task and the scenario and the knowledge of the person who's trying to do it. But it's also it's endlessly complex, but it's also kind of like a generally safe way to think about this too. It's like just connect people with information. Um, I will say that with ChatGPT coming out and things, like I do think that the kind of like ability to allow for ideation, so like getting some ideas on like, hey, like I'm trying to write a letter uh to someone to ask them for a recommendation. I've never done that before. You know, what might be in that kind of letter? I think that like those types of things like can really help people that didn't have the access to that kind of knowledge before be able to get it more easily. So that like that's something I really find a compelling use of it. The challenge is with this new wave of generative AI, where we're generating content from from all the other content that has come previously before it. Then we get into kind of like classic issues with like Section 230, like okay, well, you are now there is now content on your platform or technology that came from somewhere. Do you actually have a right to that? And if you do have a right to that, do you have to take responsibility for when it does something, that is controversial? So right now there's actually a lot of defamation lawsuits going against ChatGPT, because ChatGPT has learned to associate certain brands and certain people with things that are either entirely untrue or harmful to that person's reputation or that business's reputation. So we're really getting into, I think we're really at a place where companies building generative AI felt at least modestly comfortable that they'd be covered under Section 230. And I don't really think that that's going to be the legal conclusion when we get there.
Yeah, I mean, there is a case around Section 230 right now that's being reviewed by the Supreme Court, I believe. And it's April when we're recording this. I'm not sure if I'll get it out before that Supreme Court decision, but we'll see what the Supreme Court says about that particular case, which is, of course, as all cases are, very unique. But I think what you're saying is that even if that goes the way that the technology companies want them to go and sort of takes away liability, it doesn't stop them from being sued by any manner of people for defamation, right? I mean, I think I've seen a couple examples of Bard where people just type in, "Who am I?" the person who's typing it in, and they don't. It seems like they never quite get it right, and usually in ways that are positive, where they'll give you a degree that you didn't earn or whatever. So like, well, I guess I'm not that mad about that, but if you have a similar name to someone who did something awful or whatever,
Yeah.
that up, that could be very complicated. So this is about this generative AI thing where the AI is generating new things, or it's at least writing things, amalgamating lots of different sources that, because it's original to the AI in some way, may or may not be actually true.
Right.
But that seems a little different from what you started with, which is this information retrieval thing, which I understand, as scholars or even as regular people, we've all had that experience where we're searching for something, but we're not using the right language or the language that's going to get us to the answer, right? And so if an AI can say, well, you're asking about this, and a lot of people who do ask about this end up at this thing, right? Like I was Googling a health thing last week and I was like, why is this thing happening with my body? And I was Googling what it looked like to me. And of course, there was a medical term for it. And once I got to the medical term, I actually got to the sources that gave me the proper information.
Awesome.
Initially finding all the wrong information because a whole bunch of scam websites have started up.
Yeah.
People who had been just Googling what they see as opposed to the official medical term, right? So that seems something that's a little bit more, it kind of limits the knowledge and puts some boundaries around the knowledge that you're looking for so that it feels safe what you're getting. But then when you're generating this seemingly more complex information, it introduces more room for error, it seems, with generative AI.
Yeah, it introduces more room for error. It also makes it harder to validate too.
Right.
It when we're talking about to take a step back, a lot of the practical and business use case for AI up until, the last year or so has just been like classification is what we call the task. It just means like you give it a piece of text, you give it an image, and the AI just has to say what it thinks is in that image or in that text. So it's really crucial for social media websites because you train all these models on things like hate speech, and you hope that it can filter out a good amount of that, or at least make it an easier problem for human moderators to be able to go through and and filter out a lot of harmful content. Still an extremely complicated process that involves that is also very political and very as you mentioned, like the people, a lot of platforms don't even follow their own rules, especially Twitter right now.
I mean, let's talk about it for just a second, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The ways it can be efficient is if you can develop a model that comes up with a percentage accuracy that something is hate speech, you can take the edge cases that maybe the model can't quite figure out, give it to a human, and that human presumably should be able to say this is hate speech or not. But
yeah.
we do know from both anecdotal evidence. I think I gave a lecture on this where an artist that I know, a writer that I know, got their Instagram account suspended for commenting on someone else's account. Men are awful, which
Oh, yeah, yeah, right.
is not hate speech.
Right,
It's an
right.
opinion that actually is backed by a lot of data.
Right.
As a man, I can say that. So, and but then I think Oliver Hampson at University of Michigan did a study where he looked at um, the censorship of trans issues and found that trans people were slightly, I think, I hope I'm articulating this right, but were slightly more likely to be censored for talking about themselves than anti-trans people were for talking about why like they don't deserve to exist in the world.
Yeah,
And so we already know that this is incredibly complex task that even with the
absolutely.
billions of data points, these platforms still can't quite get right.
Yeah, and to so a couple things. First, I want to start off as I'm so glad you mentioned Oliver. I met Oliver at Kai last year, and I love all the work they're doing, and I really want to follow up with them. The second thing is like, yeah, like we're seeing this type of thing show up in a lot of places. So I have friends that study how um, anorexic communities discuss their experience on Instagram and the dynamic between kind of pro anorexic and recovering anorexic communities and that dialogue. And it can be really tough to tell when someone is actually saying like talking about something they dislike about something someone else said, um, and something that they themselves are taking ownership for having said. And so you will see a lot of like people having a really difficult time taking part in this conversation because the algorithm just can't tell. It can't tell if it can't tell if you're talking about something you believe or you're talking about something someone else believes. And it gets even worse if you're trying to have a nuanced discussion because it uh, to go back to this kind of disconnect between the type of how artificial intelligence typically works and how human intelligence typically works. Artificial intelligence up until like 3 years ago would use what we call a bag of words algorithm, which is like when I explain like how that works, it's just unbelievable that most of content moderation was done this way up until like, I don't know, I guess technically more like 5 years ago, but it literally like imagine taking something that someone said on the internet and instead of having it in the order that it appeared in, you just threw it all into a bag, shook it up, and gave it to the algorithm. And the algorithm's just like, well, the word race was in there, and the word race typically comes up more often when these horrible white people say it than, than this scenario. Or maybe they're thinking like, maybe it's not more often, but we're just more worried about when this group says it. So we're gonna be okay with a whole bunch of false positives that actually diminish the nuanced conversation that people in communities affected by online racist hate speech that they're trying to have to understand and rectify the environment that they're in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you're really getting at is, you know, human communication between two people, even when you know each other really well, is actually really complex and
Yeah.
involves much more data than just words. It
Yeah.
involves tone, it involves history between you, between your communities, between the context of saying it, right? There's so much
Yeah.
information that goes into that that is really challenging to automate. And I think this moment we're in this moment of crisis, people are, I think, in some ways being made aware of that, that actually
Yeah.
it's really hard for us to understand things and people and context and society. And we should honor the complexity of that process and the fact that we have gotten around for so long as humans with all of that complexity and data that we've had to cognitively manage. And maybe it's going to take longer than just a decade or so of developing alternative ways of doing that through more automated means for a machine to get that, right? It's taken us thousands of
Yeah.
years to get here. We probably don't want to rush into this, and yet capitalism. So
Right. Right.
I want to ask you in closing, um, you know, where do you think this is going? I've heard some interviews from some responsible AI folks that suggest that just as there is no general intelligence for everybody, right? There are very specific intelligences that are really
Yeah.
layered. Um, are we heading to a world where this kind of chat GPT generative AI, like this is the one-stop shop for all of the world's information, is maybe going to be seen as antiquated, and actually we're really going to be developing AI tools that have very specific uses for very specific businesses, populations, etc. Is that something you see, or where else do you see this
Yeah.
going, positively or dystopian?
Yeah, it's kind of a spectrum, but I think you described like a good handle on where that spectrum is. So I'll start with the very dystopian end of the spectrum, which unfortunately I've had to think a lot about lately, which is the scenario in which like OpenAI and ChatGPT become the one-stop shop for anything you could ever possibly want to do with AI. There are already lots of people that are planning with that in mind because for some capitalists that's extremely exciting, right? Like the idea that like, oh, you mean I can work with this one vendor and eliminate, I don't know, 70% of my news staff or whatever, and get the same amount of work done and make the same amount of, get the same amount of revenue. Like that is a situation that they're very excited about. And so is OpenAI, because it means that they have now become like the Band-Aid brand of AI, the only people that people think of. And it also means that we're going to be sending OpenAI all of our data. So same way that Amazon got everybody to send everybody to get Amazon to manage all of their inventory for them for everything and all of their shipping and all of that. OpenAI will have this capture of every question that people would want to have. I mean, similar to what Google did with search, right? Like they captured every question we could possibly have. And ChatGPT is trying to take over that kind of information market. And it's a huge security risk for a bunch of companies, but it also gives OpenAI, like when they partner with people like Microsoft, it gives them an opportunity to see a lot of information that they really should not about their competitors, and to really give a company that has already been disastrous for a fair market of developing technology. Now I sound like a capitalist, but I'm just really trying to speak in the terms that these people speak in. But it really, I'm worried that if everyone goes in that direction, you'll just be giving away your whole business to OpenAI and Microsoft. And while it will help you save costs in the near term, it will, I don't be surprised if Microsoft the next day has a clone of your business, or a clone of whatever else you're doing. So I think that that's the very dystopian side of it. I hope it doesn't happen. I'm pretty sure it won't happen, but I honestly don't know. Like, there's a lot of excitement and hype around Chat GPT right now that is really difficult to deflate. Um, and I think that a lot of the letter about getting people to pause on AI is written by people that know that, like, if they can get you scared about what it could potentially do, then at least you're admitting that it can do those things. And then everybody, kind of will work under the assumption that, like, well, hey, they were the ones that brought up regulation, so I guess we could probably do business with them. And hey, they're cutting us a little bit of a deal that they're not going to cut smaller competitors or anything like that. Like, they start to warm up to this idea of centralizing all their information into OpenAI. So okay, I'm gonna stop with the dystopian side of it and go toward, like, the much more, what I hope is a more reasonable, or I don't know, I don't know if reasonable is even in the cards anymore, but a more preferable outcome, which is we are getting a lot of good pushback to that, to the letter. And we are seeing, like, the White House actually hire people that are good with understanding responsible AI and AI safety. The White House AI Bill of Rights, which is very unfortunately named because it sounds like it's a Bill of Rights for the AI. It's actually a Bill of Rights for those of us to be protected from AI. But it is actually, it shows that the White House is listening to people that care about what happens after the capitalists have made their money. And that, to me, is very promising. I think that there's also, even when there's not legislation coming out in the United States that helps protect us against a lot of data capture and data privacy issues and AI issues, there are lots of laws coming out in the EU that these companies need to do business in. So they're, the same way that GDPR affected the entire United States. So will the AI Act and the I think it's called the Digital Services Act that's coming out of the EU. So it's I think that there's some hope that there we're starting to get some legal traction. I think it's gonna take a long time. When the average age of a senator is, like, over the average retirement age, we really need some younger people in office that grew up with this technology well enough to understand how it impacts the world, to be in those positions to help formulate those laws and get them out there. And I think that that's something that is one thing to look forward to. I think the other thing to look forward to is seeing the discourse on fair machine learning and artificial intelligence start to mature, not just by people in the industry, but also by journalists and by everyday content creators, helping them get to a place where, or not helping them. I mean, I think they're actually doing, they're making that progress kind of on their own, but getting to a place where they're now not thinking of Elon Musk as the person who knows everything about every technology they could possibly care about. They start to understand that, like, yeah, he's just doing this to get a rise out of people. He's got ulterior motives that he is very comfortable with pursuing at the risk of everyone else's, well-being. So I think that, like, I'm hopeful that there will be a cultural shift and a legal landscape shift that makes it harder for a lot of this just kind of general AI grifting to to succeed. but we'll see.
Yeah, let's all hope for that. Let's all hope for taking back control over our culture and our systems. Um, run for office if you know something about AI. You want to do it responsibly.
Yeah.
I think we all have to kind of participate and advocate. And I think the history of community-based activism around media and technology in the United States is scattered, but it's there. And I think the more people realize that these things actually matter to their lives and they need to have conversations about them with their community, with their legislatures, with people in power, talk back to companies, send them those notes. I think the better we all will if we all participate. I know there's a lot going on. There's a lot to participate in, and this is just another thing. But I think it's truly important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. It's been a great pleasure to reconnect with you and learn from you.
Likewise. Yeah, always great to see you, AJ.